Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone in today's class for the third intermediate grade. Our textbook is Super Goal 6 and today we will cover culture shock, reading and project. This lesson will be presented by me, teacher Manzana Harbi, and the sign language by Mr. Fawaz Al-Agil. So let's begin. Our objectives in today's lesson, we hope that at the end of this lesson you will be able to read about different cultures using the reading strategy, using subtitles, and also answer questions about the text and design a list of advice to a travel. Before we do this, let's make quick revision on our last lesson. Last lesson we had a discussion question, about you question, and also a conversation. We have discussed in the first part of our last lesson different questions where I ask you, for example, what are the do's and don'ts that you may know about different countries, the things that maybe is allowed in a country but not allowed in a different country, and also what are the cultural differences that you may know about in terms maybe in regards of language, in regards of food, in regards of greeting. So there are, of course, cultural differences. So what do you know about them? And number two, are there any different customs in different parts of your country? When we say that we have agreed, last lesson we talked about this, we have agreed that there are, of course, different customs in different country, or we're moving to one country to another. But what about the same country? Do they have different customs? And if they do, what are the differences? And number three, have you ever lived or traveled abroad? And did you have any difficulty in adjusting? So maybe you, maybe someone you know who went abroad and traveled to a different country. Well, what do you think the difficulty that you have faced, or he has faced in adjusting, in trying to adapting to that culture? And also we talked about if you ever had a problem because of cultural differences. It's not necessarily that when you travel abroad, but maybe when, for a newcomer who visit your country or new visitors. And finally, the common gestures that in your culture. We agreed that in different countries, in most of the countries, they have different gestures, different moves, different practices. So what are they? Could you list some of these gestures that differ, and you try to compare it? So we had a very interesting time on our last lesson. Not only this, but also we have listened to a conversation between Will and Edgar, where Will asked his friend Edgar about his trip to China. What are the things that he faced, and also what are the difficulties? And Edgar talked about some of the difficulties and differences that he faced there in China in regards of food, the way they eat, and also in regards of language, and also in regards of, which is, he found it weird, as Edgar said, which is the surnames that they usually have the last name or family name before the first name. This was these were one of the incidents that Edgar mentioned from his trip to China. And to make it more interesting, I ask you to, in your turn part, to try to role play the same conversation with someone, maybe a friend of yours or a family member or people you know who went, or you know that they went to different place or different country. So you can practice the same conversation as we have listened or practiced here between Will and Edgar. You can be in Will's shoes and try to ask him the partner of yours, to ask him different questions about the place he went to, and also about the cultural differences. So now, in our lesson for today we have a reading and project. And before we start our reading, I would like to ask you a very important question, which is, what problems do you think people have adapting to a different culture? So of course, when we say that people who went abroad or who traveled abroad, of course, they sometimes face difficulties in regards of cultural differences. So in your opinion, maybe based on a personal experience, or maybe based on others' experience that you may know of, What are the problems that they usually have in adapting to a different culture, in trying to adjust, in trying to fit in to a new culture or a new place? Do you remember what kind of difficulties they usually have? And what do people usually do in these difficulties? In regard of, as we said, in regard of the language, when they don't have the same language, what do they usually do? Or maybe in regards of the way they, or their clothes, or in regard of their food. So there are, of course, different difference in culture and also in that regard. So what do people, or what do they usually do? Try to think of it. So I would like you here to have a look at these phases. Here we have 5 phases, 5 levels. And these levels are the adjustment phase, the emptiness of or rejection phase, or the conformist phase, or assimilation phase, or complete adjustment, or reverse culture shock. I know that these phases may be strange to you at the beginning, but I'm going to explain it to you as well when we read. So let me ask you also a couple of questions. First, when people are trying something new, how do they usually feel? When people, they try something new for the first time, what do you think they usually feel? Very good, yes, they may feel excited, they may feel energized, they may feel optimistic for some reason, they may feel happy for some reason. And do you think people feel happy if they feel empty? If they feel empty inside, do you think they feel happy? I guess not. And what about this? When people reject something, do they accept it or not accept it? When we say that someone rejecting something, does that mean he accept that thing or he did not accept it? Of course, he didn't accept it. And when you move to a new country, is it a good idea or bad idea to behave like the people in the new country behave? So when you move to a different country, different than yours, and is it a good idea to try to blend in and you act as they act, or it's not a good idea? We call this, by the way, we call this behaving like the other people confirming. So this is one of the phases that we're going to read about, which is behaving like the other people. Further questions. What happens to most people after they stay in a new country for a long time? Do they begin to feel comfortable in the new country? So when they stay in a different country for a long time and not only for a short period. So do you think that they feel comfortable in that new country? Maybe most of you would say yes. This is why he extended maybe his stay. This is why he stayed longer. So we call this the assimilation. We call it the assimilation phase, where people usually extend their stay. And do the people get used to things in the new country? They get used to their habits, to the customs, to the traditions, to the language, to different things. We call this, most of you would say yes, so this is why they stayed longer, because they're now used to different things in that country. So we call this the adjustment. We call this adjustment phase. So, and when you go in reverse, which direction do you go? When someone says that he's going in reverse, does that mean he's going backwards or forwards? Of course, he's going backwards. This is what they mean by reverse. So here we have covered maybe the meaning of all of these 5 different phases or 5 different stages or levels that we have introduced in the beginning. So now what I would like you to do is to open your books on page 64. I would like you now to open your books on page 64. On page 64, as you can see, here we have a very interesting reading text talks about this particular issue, where people go to travel to different country and how do they adjust or adapt. So I'm going to read this text. I'm going to read each paragraph twice. The first time, I'm going to read it without pointing, but the second time I'm going to read it while I am pointing. So it is recommended that for you to follow with me while I read. So let's begin with the first part. A fish out of water. Almost everyone who studies, lives, or works abroad experiences some degree of culture shock. This period of cultural adjustment involves everything from getting used to the food and language to smaller things like learning how to use the telephone. No matter how patient and flexible you are, adjusting to a new culture can sometimes be difficult and frustrating. Some people get depressed and very homesick. But don't panic. These are all totally normal reactions, and you are not alone. The term culture shock was first used by writer Kalervo Oberg in 1954. He found that all human beings experience the same feelings when they travel to or live in a different country or culture. Oberg identified 5 distinct stages of culture shock. So now I'm going to read again, but this time I'm going to point, so try to follow with me while I am reading. So, a fish out of water. Almost everyone who studies, lives, or works abroad experiences some degree of culture shock. This period of cultural adjustment involves everything from getting used to the food and language to smaller things like learning how to use the telephone. No matter how patient and flexible you are, adjusting to a new culture can sometimes be difficult and frustrating. Some people get depressed and very homesick. But don't panic. These are all totally normal reactions and you are not alone. The term culture shock was first used by writer Kalervo Oberg in 1954. He found that all human beings experience the same feelings when they travel to or live in a different country or culture. Oberg identified 5 distinct stages of culture shock. So now let's read more about these different stages. The first one is the adjustment phase or the adjustment stage. This period can last 6 months or longer. The newcomer is excited about being in a new place and experiencing a new lifestyle. Some problems may occur, but the person usually tends to accept them as part of the adjustment to another country and novelty of being in a new place. People are generally helpful to the newcomer, and that person feels welcome. Number 2. Emptiness or rejection phase. The newcomer has to deal with the usual problems of accommodation, transportation, shopping, in other words, not finding your favorite foods, and very often not being able to communicate fluently in the local language. The local people may not understand why the newcomer is making such a big deal over what they see as a small problem. At this point, the newcomer starts to complain about and maybe even reject the new country. So here we have read about 2 stages. The first one, or the first level, called the adjustment phase, where can last for 6 months or longer, where the newcomer is excited and happy about the new place and experiencing a new lifestyle. Yes, of course, there are problems that may occur, but he usually tends to accept them. He is happy with these kinds of problems. And because these are part of his adjustment to this place. So people are usually helpful to a newcomer, and usually the newcomers feels welcome by the local people. So this is about the first stage. What about the second stage? The second stage, called the emptiness or rejection phase, where he has to deal with usual problems like housing or accommodation, like transportation, like shopping, where he couldn't find a place or his usual items that he can find in his home, and also not able to communicate with the language. So the local people may not understand the newcomer, and they may do not understand why he's making a big deal about a small problem. So at this point, the newcomer start to complain start to express his rejections, express his frustration, for example, and maybe even reject the new country. This is what you call rejection. It means he does not accept that new country. So this is the second stage. Now, let's read about the third and the fourth stage. The fourth one, called the conformist phase. Gaining some understanding of the new culture, its ideals and its values brings a new feeling of pleasure. The crisis is over when the newcomer learns to understand the cultural differences but hasn't completely adjusted to the new culture. Number 4, assimilation phase or complete adjustment. In this phase, the person accepts the food, the habits, and customs of the new country, and may even find some things better than things back home. The newcomer becomes completely adjusted and feels comfortable in the new place. On returning home, the traveler will miss the new friends and the new country and will cherish the memories forever. So, as the third one, the conformist phase, where people, when they gain some understanding of the culture, the ideals, and the habits, the customs, and traditions as well. So the crisis is over when he learns to understand and when he learns to accept these differences. So there are no longer a problem for the newcomer, because he hasn't completely adjusted, but he can accept all these changes. As of the fourth one, which is complete adjustment, in this phase, people usually, or the person, accept the same food, accept the same culture, accept the same habits, and also trying to practice the language of that country. And sometimes the newcomer becomes adjusted and feels comfortable to that new place, and he will cherish the friends and the memories he made back at this country. So this is about the fourth phase, or the fourth stage. As the last one, the reverse cultural shock. This is when the person comes back to the home country. The returnee may have been away from home for a long time and gets a re-entry shock. Many things may have changed, and it will take a while to get used to home again. So, as we can read from the title, it's the reverse cultural shock. It's not for a new country, it's for your home country, where you spend a long time at different country, and now it's time to go back to your home country, but you can find it difficult to adjust to your home, and you take even longer time to try to adjust to it. So this is what we call the reverse cultural shock. So here we have read about 5 different phases that Berg has presented that usually explain most of the cases about cultural shock and how to handle each one of them. So now let's move on to the following exercise. Here we have, as you can see, 8 different terms or vocabularies, and here we have 8 definitions. What we need to do is try to match each definition with the appropriate word. So let's begin with the first one, flexible. What do you mean by flexible? Which is B, able to change in different situation. Number 2, frustrating means E, annoying because you cannot do something that you want. And number 3, homesick means A, missing home and family. And number 4, stage, it means F, one level or phase in a series. And number 5, newcomer, it is D, person who has arrived recently. And number 6, novelty, which is H, something that is new and interesting. And number 7, values, which is C, believes about what is right or wrong. And finally, number 8, cherish, which is G, to remember a pleasant feeling for a long time. So here you go. These are the answers of exercise number 1. Now let's move on to exercise number B. Here we have questions that we already have introduced to its answer. The first one, what do you think fish out of water means? Well, it means being in a new place and not being comfortable. So this is exactly like the fish out of water. And number 2, what do you understand by the term culture shock? We understand that the period of adjustment, when someone moves to a new country, he may be shocked a little bit. And number 3, when did the expression first appear? As we have read, it was used by the writer Claire Voeberg in 1954. The final question we have, which is, in your own words, classify the 5 different stages of cultural shock. Well, we can say that the adjustment phase is where the newcomer is excited and happy to that new place. Emptiness or rejection phase, where he has to deal with problems and he may not accept that country. And conformist phase, which is where the newcomer learns to understand and accept differences. And next we have the assimilation or complete adjustment, where he's adjusted, the newcomer, to the culture and feels very comfortable. And finally, which is the reverse culture shock, when the person returns home and he will have to readapt or readjust to that new place. So, discussion question, here I'm going to tell you those discussion questions. Try to think of it with a family member. The first one, which is, have you ever lived for a period of time in another country? And what was your experience like? Did you get culture shock, reverse culture shock? Do you like that place much, or you didn't? You like your home? So what do you think about this experience? And if you haven't experienced such a situation, you may ask people around you who has. And number 2, what experiences of cultural shock have people that you know and when they visited another country? So again, you can ask people around you about the experience they face as in cultural shock and what are the problems they face, and also when they visit another country. So you may explore a lot of ideas and brainstorm these ideas to help you understand more about our theme, which is culture shock. So before we finish, don't forget to try with your classmates to think of advice to give to travelers to your country. Make a list of tips to help them fit into the local culture. So imagine that there are newcomers who visit your country, and try to make a list of instructions maybe or advice to help them to fit in and adjust to your country. So now we have reached the end of our lesson. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.